not at the camera.
For his keynote, he's looking into camera 3.
South Africa's healthcare system is under tremendous strain. Patients wait for hours, some traveling hundreds of kilometers, in the hope of seeing a doctor. At the same time, over 800 qualified young doctors stand ready to help, yet they are unemployed. That's why Profmed created Finder, a platform that connects graduate doctors with practices with locum needs. Through Finder, you'll find meaningful work opportunities with practices eager for your talent. To kickstart your journey, Profmed is offering a special incentive. The first 100 doctors to sign up will receive 6 months of free medical aid with Profmed. Finder offers more than just jobs. It's a movement to improve healthcare access and empower young doctors. If you're ready to make a difference, join Finder today and be part of South Africa's healthcare solution. Finder, your journey begins here. Together, let's shape the future of healthcare in South Africa. Finder by Profmed. Finder.doctor. Medical aid for professionals.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the special broadcast brought to you by Profmed in partnership with Business Day TV. I'm Michael Avery, and today we gather at a really pivotal moment in South Africa's policy history to unpack the debate around national health insurance and its promise of universal healthcare. Now, the NHI Act has been signed, the ink is dry, but the country is certainly far from settled. In fact, as we speak, no fewer than 6 legal challenges are before South African courts, from Solidarity, SAMA, we've got the Health Funders Association, the Hospital Association, the Board of Healthcare Funders, and the private practitioners, all contesting either the constitutionality, the affordability, or the sheer implementability of the NHI Act, from allegations of procedural irregularity in the President's assent to accusations of violated rights, fiscal irrationality, and overreach of ministerial power. These challenges reflect the high stakes and the deep uncertainty surrounding this massive health policy overall. Healthcare, after all, is where public policy meets personal experience. It's about affordability, it's about access, and ultimately trust in the system. As South Africa moves from policy paper to implementation under the recently signed NHI Act, the questions about who pays, what works, and how do we get there to a better system without breaking what still works. Thankfully, we're not having this conversation in a vacuum. It's anchored by data from Profmed's 2025 State of Health Report, which provides some sobering insights. For both consumers in the public and private sector, 75% of respondents believe NHI will worsen healthcare access. Over 62% of medical aid users have had to pay out of pocket for benefits not covered, and 60% have little or no confidence in the public health system. And yet the cost of private care is fast becoming unaffordable. Caught in the crossfire, patients, doctors and funders all asking the same question: is there a better path to universal healthcare? That's really the heart of today's discussion, and we begin with someone who spent years fighting for a more transparent and more sustainable system. To set the scene, it really gives me great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Craig Comrie, who's Chief Executive of Profmed. Craig is not just the head of South Africa's largest restricted medical scheme for professionals, he's a vocal advocate for sustainable healthcare reform, an innovator through initiatives like Finder, and a fierce believer in empowering South Africans to understand and optimize their medical cover. And his address today is going to draw directly from Profmed's latest State of Health report to help ground this conversation in facts, not fear, not ideology and uncertainty, and certainly not partisanship. So, Craig, it's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you. It is an important subject, and it's something that affects everybody. Our State of the Nation survey that we conducted was really an effort to bring the voice of a health consumer into the discussion. We see the various legal challenges coming through, but we wanted to hear the voice of the health consumer. Our specific context is the professional, and so we try to poll professionals in the market, those that belong to Profmed itself and others who are obviously economically active. Maybe many of them are members of medical schemes, but there are others that weren't members of medical schemes that provided us with some really important information to reference in that state of health in South Africa. The first interesting comment that we had back from the survey was in fact that 70% of those individuals indicated they were on average too satisfied with the healthcare system. And the number's an interesting one because it points towards another index that's actually the World Health Organizational Index on universal healthcare coverage. Not a lot of people know, but that index indicates that South Africa is on the 70% mark as well. So very similar to the feedback we're getting from our professional healthcare consumers as well. And so what that means is that there's still room to improve. And I gather that's where the economic and the healthcare reform debates have actually started, to try and find how do we make a leap forward in terms of improvement of healthcare for everybody who consumes health in South Africa. So the survey points to a few things, and what we did is to make sure that we approached it in a neutral fashion. And so we asked people what did they feel about the quality of healthcare in South Africa, and that was the 70% that were satisfied. What was the biggest challenge for healthcare in South Africa very much pointed to the exact points that are currently under debate within the NHI policy and the reform legal cases as well. And so for private sector healthcare, it was all about affordability. 70% actually felt that they were receiving value for money in terms of the medical schemes that they belonged to. But there was 30% that felt that it was just too expensive. And so we get a very clear indication that in the private sector, affordability is the main challenge. In the public sector, a little bit differently. The two big items that came through is the skills accessed in the public sector. Being able to access the doctors, specialists quickly in the public sector was a problem. In fact, the third issue that was raised was the queues that we thought would actually feature quite prominently. In fact, the second issue that was raised by individuals in the survey pointed to just the general state of public sector infrastructure, cleanliness and maintenance. So it does point us to where we need to improve health in general, in both the public and private sector. We need to do better. And I don't think the movements or the incremental movements that I think would help in improving universal healthcare access is that far from us. We then asked about the NHI and the confidence levels of individuals in the NHI being rolled out in South Africa, and that indicated a lack of confidence. 90% felt that there was no confidence that NHI would make any real difference. So very negative views in terms of the policy, and probably points to the vacuum on how to finance, how do you implement such a bold and significant step in South Africa, and whether there is enough finance behind it, what are the benefits that you are going to access, and am I going to stand to lose something that I currently have in terms of my medical scheme cover and the services I currently access. So all in all, I think it points very clearly that we do still need health reform for both the public and specifically in the private sector if we are going to improve healthcare to the healthcare consumer as well. As much as we resist the NHI and those very big gaps that we still don't know how it will be implemented and what that would mean for us, a lot of the answers, like many things in South Africa, I think lies in the fact that we need growth, we need employment, and with that would come higher tax revenues, and with that maybe affordability would become less of an issue. The other thing that was really different in our survey was the feedback from the people being surveyed. They said that almost 60% understood NHI, which is a very complex document itself. It's a very complex policy point. And then we asked them, well, what would you do if NHI would not be implemented? What reforms would you make in the private sector? And a significant amount came through, and the dominant reason was, well, reform and make medical schemes mandatory. It's not an unusual statement, and I guess the professionals are close to knowing what's happening in the marketplace. They know what's happening in healthcare specifically, and so they knew exactly that the mandatory membership would create affordability within the medical scheme space while creating less pressure in a public sector space. Mandatory cover has been a recommendation on the table for the last 5 years from the Health Market Inquiry. So it's not a new reform, but we need to start actioning realistic reforms that actually deliver better services, healthcare services to all consumers of health in South Africa.
Fascinating insights, and again, we are talking about professionals here, and I think a lot of the work that we did in the Health Market Inquiry indicated where we need to go. We're not terrible, as you said, 70%, and very benchmarked with the World Health Organization's findings, but there are still gaps, and we can move forward. Obviously, the question is NHI the tool to take us forward, and does it address some of those glaring issues around infrastructure, around funding, and what does good look like? If we're to talk about universal healthcare access and quality, I don't think any South African can quibble with those very noble goals and aims, and wanting to roll out better, more affordable, more accessible quality healthcare. But it's always about how do we get there, how do we do it, and what is the best policy lever? So we're going to be unpacking that on the panel. Thank you very much. Just to wrap up this first session, that was Craig Comrie, who gave us some insights into the recent research that was undertaken by Profmed of its members, asking what they thought. The data gives us a powerful baseline for today's conversation. We're going to be joined by a stellar panel shortly, leaders across finance, healthcare and policy, to debate the future of healthcare reform in South Africa. So please don't go anywhere. We'll be back with you in a couple of minutes.
South Africa's healthcare system is under tremendous strain. Patients wait for hours, some traveling hundreds of kilometers, in the hope of seeing a doctor. At the same time, over 800 qualified young doctors stand ready to help. Yet, they are unemployed. That's why Profmed created Finder, a platform that connects graduate doctors with practices with locum needs. Through Finder, you'll find meaningful work opportunities with practices eager for your talent. To kickstart your journey, Profmed is offering a special incentive. The first 100 doctors to sign up will receive 6 months of free medical aid with Profmed. Finder offers more than just jobs. It's a movement to improve healthcare access and empower young doctors. If you're ready to make a difference, join Finder today and be part of South Africa's healthcare solution. Finder, your journey begins here. Together, let's shape the future of healthcare in South Africa. Finder by Profmed. Finder.doctor. Medical aid for professionals. South Africa's healthcare system is under tremendous strain. Patients wait for hours, some traveling hundreds of kilometers, in the hope of seeing a doctor. At the same time, over 800 qualified young doctors stand ready to help. Yet, they are unemployed. That's why Profmed created Finder, a platform that connects graduate doctors with practices with locum needs. Through Finder, you'll find meaningful work opportunities with practices eager for your talent. To kickstart your journey, Profmed is offering a special incentive. The first 100 doctors to sign up will receive 6 months of free medical aid with Profmed. Finder offers more than just jobs. It's a movement to improve healthcare access and empower young doctors. If you're ready to make a difference, join Finder today and be part of South Africa's healthcare solution. Finder, your journey begins here. Together, let's shape the future of healthcare in South Africa. Finder by Profmed. Finder.doctor. Medical aid for professionals. South Africa's healthcare system is under tremendous strain. Patients wait for hours, some traveling hundreds of kilometers, in the hope of seeing a doctor. At the same time, over 800 qualified young doctors stand ready to help, yet they are unemployed. That's why Profmed created Finder, a platform that connects graduate doctors with practices with locum needs. Through Finder, you'll find meaningful work opportunities with practices eager for your talent. To kickstart your journey, Profmed is offering a special incentive. The first 100 doctors to sign up will receive 6 months of free medical aid with Profmed. Finder offers more than just jobs. It's a movement to improve healthcare access and empower young doctors. If you're ready to make a difference, join Finder today and be part of South Africa's healthcare solution. Finder, your journey begins here. Together, let's shape the future of healthcare in South Africa. Finder by Profmed. Finder.doctor. Medical aid for professionals. South Africa's healthcare system is under tremendous strain. Patients wait for hours, some traveling hundreds of kilometers, in the hope of seeing a doctor. At the same time, over 800 qualified young doctors stand ready to help, yet they are unemployed. That's why Profmed created Finder, a platform that connects graduate doctors with practices with locum needs. Through Finder, you'll find meaningful work opportunities with practices eager for your talent. To kickstart your journey, Profmed is offering a special incentive. The first 100 doctors to sign up will receive 6 months of free medical aid with Profmed. Finder offers more than just jobs. It's a movement to improve healthcare access and empower young doctors. If you're ready to make a difference, join Finder today and be part of South Africa's healthcare solution. Finder, your journey begins here. Together, let's shape the future of healthcare in South Africa. Finder by Profmed. Finder.doctor. Medical aid for professionals. South Africa's healthcare system is under tremendous strain. Patients wait for hours, some traveling hundreds of kilometers, in the hope of seeing a doctor. At the same time, over 800 qualified young doctors stand ready to help, yet they are unemployed. That's why Profmed created Finder, a platform that connects graduate doctors with practices with locum needs. Through Finder, you'll find meaningful work opportunities with practices eager for your talent. To kickstart your journey, Profmed is offering a special incentive. The first 100 doctors to sign up will receive 6 months of free medical aid with Profmed. Finder offers more than just jobs. It's a movement to improve healthcare access and empower young doctors. If you're ready to make a difference, join Finder today and be part of South Africa's healthcare solution. Finder, your journey begins here. Together, let's shape the future of healthcare in South Africa. Finder by Profmed. Finder.doctor. Medical aid for professionals. South Africa's healthcare system is under tremendous strain. Patients wait for hours, some traveling hundreds of kilometers, in the hope of seeing a doctor. At the same time, over 800 qualified young doctors stand ready to help, yet they are unemployed. That's why Profmed created Finder, a platform that connects graduate doctors with practices with locum needs. Through Finder, you'll find meaningful work opportunities with practice.
Well, I'm joined now by a really esteemed panel. Barry Childs is Joint CEO for Insights Actuaries and Consultants. He's one of South Africa's most respected healthcare actuaries. His expertise lies in analytics, risk and healthcare system design, and he's worked on everything from disease burden models to the financial sustainability of medical schemes. He brings a really deep actuarial insight to this debate. Somewhere in the middle of the panel, next to him is Martin Kingston. He's Executive Chairman of Rothschild & Co. South Africa is a veteran, Martin is, I should say, a veteran investment banker who advised on over 150 landmark transactions in both the private and the public sector, as Vice President as well of Business Unity South Africa and a leading voice on structural reform. Martin brings a really sharp economic lens to the NHI conversation. To my immediate right is Taneshan Naidu, CEO of the Health Funders Association. Taneshan represents over 4 million medical scheme members, a technocrat turned healthcare reformer. He's led the HFA's legal challenge to the NHI Act and proposed a multi-fund hybrid model to achieve true universal healthcare, and a rare voice that blends both technical depth with strategic clarity as well. And then rounding off the panel, we've got Craig Comrie of Profmed. Now, Martin, I've got to ask you, I mean, the million-dollar question is about rands and cents. And what do you think of the financial viability, sustainability of moving to an NHI, given what we've seen this year with the fiscal pressures on the sovereign, the debates in the GNU around upping VAT by a couple of % to fund an NHI? It would have to be much more than that. I mean, how realistic is finding the funds for a centralized fund for the NHI?
Well, Michael, the way that it's currently structured, it's not realistic. In fact, we've argued that it's not financially viable, it's not implementable, and it's not practical. And indeed, as you have indicated, we need to live within our means. We had not one, not two, but 3 budgets that have to be tabled. And in the final analysis, we don't have the fiscal space. Indeed, even for the spending that we've got in front of us at the moment, what we have said as business is that we need to have a proposition that achieves the objectives, but not in the way that is currently being proposed. We have to make sure that we leverage the private sector, not that we abolish the private sector. And to do that, we need to be very thoughtful about how we can partner between government and the private sector to be able to ensure that we can achieve the goals and objectives of universal health coverage. That's not in the way in which it's currently structured. And we've said as much. We think that there are certain principles, including the fact that we can't have a single fund model. We need to have a multi-fund model. We need to use the resources, not just financial resources, but infrastructural skills and expertise. Indeed, the very model that, Michael, you and I have talked about before in the context of the partnership between business and government to leverage the entire system, that is not currently what is in front of us.
And we saw great work through COVID in things like the Solidarity Fund and elsewhere, where the public and the private sectors can come together and work together quite well. Barry, if you look at the actuarial modelling you've done, I mean, do we have any idea what the realistic per capita cost of an NHI fund would be?
Michael, no, not really. There aren't any a single version of the truth for what NHI will cost, partly because benefits haven't been defined, funding sources haven't been defined. And it's really not clear also what the end game is going to look like from an NHI point of view. The people that have been looking at this tend to just look at the general pots of money available, what's currently spent in the public sector, call it 270 billion rand, and what's generally spent in the private sector and medical scheme side, which is, call it another 260, 270 billion rand. And that overall, that's about 8.5% of GDP, which is there or thereabouts in terms of what countries should spend. And if we put that all into one pot, the NHI pot, where does that get us? So, I mean, to be honest, no really robust costing has been done further than that, as I say, just identifying those various pots of money, of which there are smaller sub-pieces like the medical aid tax credit and government subsidies of other medical aids. So they're big pools of money to sort of maybe be moved around on the board, but from an overall costing or feasibility or sustainability point of view, no real actuarial or technical work has been done there. even by Treasury as far as we can tell. Certainly nothing in the public domain.
And it's important when you talk about what's spent in the private sector on medical schemes versus what's available and spent by government in the public sector, that's after-tax money that individuals are then taking to fund private medical schemes. Tanesh, I just want to come to this idea of a multi-funder model versus a single funder model. And I think it's quite central to how we move forward to this desirable goal of universal healthcare, which we can all agree upon. And you've been a proponent of a multi-funder model. Just talk to me about why you feel a single funder model is less desirable than a multi-funder and how it would work.
Sure. So I think it's important, let's recognize that South Africa actually has one of the best private healthcare systems in the world, maybe even in the top 5, right? And that's actually been built on a multi-fund model. And that's driven by competition, innovation, and private sector really has come together. Now, and that's actually what we want to advocate further: drive more competition, drive more innovation, drive more remuneration models. Now, unfortunately, with the NHI Act implementing a single fund model, that threatens that innovation. It actually is regressive. What it would mean, right, just on the combined public-private healthcare sector, medical scheme members would have to pay 1.5 times what they're currently paying in taxes, but experience a 43% decrease in access to care. And that's actually the constitutional point we have. So, but NHI actually went a little bit further, right? It actually says if we want to, and it's promised, the same level of cover that medical schemes have for all 61 million people, that would take 941 billion rand. And to fund 941 billion rand, it would be more than double what we currently pay in tax. But, just to give an example, right, we talk about VAT. VAT is currently 15%. To fund 941 billion rand, VAT would have to increase from 15% to 36%.
It makes conversations around NHI almost feel academic. When you have such a yawning chasm between what the reality is in terms of rands and cents on the ground versus what is practical. Craig, if you look at it, the State of Health report suggests, as we mentioned, that over 75% of people believe NHI will worsen healthcare access. Is this just a failure of communication, or is it a red flag in the design that stands out for you?
It is both. It's the fact that NHI is such a complex policy to try and roll out. One thing you absolutely need is the collaboration of the whole industry, whether it's the public or the private sector. The problem is, if you look at the different people in the private sector, the key role players, they are all opposing and have legal cases against NHI. So NHI has sidelined those key stakeholders to participate. We need a space where they can collaborate, not be sidelined in the conversation. And so that, for me, is the place we have to move to in the future. We have to get to a space where we can collaborate and improve healthcare in a practical way, in an incremental way, something that we know we can fund, something that is realistic and will make a difference in the life of the health consumer tomorrow, not 10, 20, 30 years' time.
And also to calibrate expectations, because I worry that expectations are being created that everyone overnight will all of a sudden have access to the same kind of quality of care that is available in the best in the private sector. And quite clearly, looking at the pathways and the referrals without getting into the weeds of the detail, that is very far from the case. Barry, let's talk about solutions here. So what would good look like? How do we progressively realize universal health care and an improvement of access and quality within our financial constraints and means?
Our view is that the system needs a convergent redesign. So at the moment, the public and the private sectors are not coherently designed together. They operate almost separately. And for many years, leading up to the 2007-2008 NHI policy trajectory, there was very good research on how the systems would function together, both from a fiscal and provision point of view. The the other problem is that we have to find a way to deal with the inequity, which is this massive difference in per capita spending and access to resources between the public and the private sector, and that is one of the key challenges. Our health system reflects the imbalance in our economy overall. So how do we do that? The public sector needs some more money and needs to spend that money better. The private sector doesn't need more money, but it does need to spend the money better. And so how do we design that system together? We used to talk about mandatory membership of medical schemes if you were earning above a certain income, but that ship has sailed. We don't think that would fly from a policy point of view now. One of the interesting policy interventions we think would work and would actually tick the boxes for both sides in the debate would be some form of NHI tax for non-medical scheme members. At the moment, if you drop off from your medical scheme, you essentially become a public sector patient, but with no additional revenue going to the public sector for your treatment. So if all medical scheme members stopped their contributions and became public sector patients, there's no additional revenue for public sector. Whereas if there was some kind of NHI tax for non-medical scheme members that could catch them, now you have a much more rational choice set for those people who could belong to medical schemes and don't at the moment. That's about 20% of income earners over 500,000 Rand a year. There's just no, they're hopping in and out of the system. They're abusing both systems, as it were. So an NHI tax for non-medical aid members earning above a certain income level would make that choice much more rational. It would raise additional revenue for the public sector and would allow much more fluidity for people if they're joining or leaving the medical aid sector. But that is a multi-fund model. That's not what the NHI says. So it's a difficult to get that policy suggestion.
And it provides a nice incentive to improve the public sector, to attract
100%, absolutely.
More,
it becomes much more competitive.
Yeah. Where do you see the infrastructure bottlenecks currently that really need to be fixed if we are going to get to this idea, this promised land of universal healthcare?
I think there too. I mean, the health system is so complex. Peter Drucker was famous for saying, a hospital is pretty much the most complicated organizational human system you can create, and the health system is an expansion of that. I think the infrastructure struggles within the healthcare sector locally, on the public sector side, mirror the infrastructure problems more generally. We need more money, and we need to be able to spend that money more effectively to improve infrastructure. And hospitals are complicated, very expensive, intense equipment. It needs to be maintained, etc. A bigger bottleneck, which is a bigger problem to solve, actually, is on the human resources for health, where we've had some good plans for improving our human resources for health capabilities, production of doctors, nurses, etc., while at the same time have empty posts and unfunded posts. So we need to produce more, but even the ones we're producing, we can't employ where there's the most need in the public sector. So there are some real challenges there.
And Craig, I mean, you've developed Finder to solve for that capacity constraints directly. What have been some of the biggest capacity constraint findings that you've uncovered and that we need to address in order to get to universal healthcare?
Well, much of the Profmed membership is made up of doctors, and we see the average age of a GP now being 55, 56 years old. And so we quickly spotted the fact that we've seen young community service doctors exit that part of their training and not being able to be employed in the public sector. And so we thought, well, how do we match the two? If there's an older grouping that at some stage will need to retire and stop servicing the public, even if it is in the medical scheme section, how do we put the two together? Because we need every doctor that we can keep in South Africa. There's lots of research that indicates that we're at 3 doctors for every 1,000 people, while the average tends to be around 9 or 10. So we need to keep every doctor we produce. We cannot have unemployed doctors in the country. And whether the private sector needs to step forward and the public sector too, we really need to retain our future foundation of whatever health system we have in the future of South Africa.
It's so important that while we're doing this, we don't further erode that already very quite brittle base. You try and book a specialist, go to an OBGYN, you've got a 6-month waiting list, and it's a wicked problem. There's insurance issues, there's medical malpractice, there's all of that. I don't want to get stuck into those weeds, though. Marty, listening to what we've just heard, this idea of creating a special tax for for those who are not part of medical schemes to fund an NHI, for example, and focusing more on the capacity constraints and those infrastructure bottlenecks. What do you make of that within the broader context of other models that you've looked at around the world? Obviously, there's the NHS in the UK, famed for maybe waiting a long time if you want to get a particular procedure. But are there other markets that you've looked at that we might be able to model ourselves on to get to universal healthcare?
Well, I don't think that there's an analogous situation that we can find anywhere, unfortunately, because as we know, Michael, South Africa is a law unto itself in terms of its behaviour, but also, more importantly, the way in which society is both stratified and the performance of the economy. So we can't compare South Africa to the UK. We can't compare South Africa to other countries that have got sophisticated NHS systems, most of which work relatively well. Here we've got two major constraints. One is that we have a very high level of unemployment, as we know. We have very low GDP growth, and therefore so the per capita income is a particular challenge, and therefore the burden does fall on the state for a large proportion of the population to be able to provide basic health care. And the state needs to be supported and capacitated to do that. But at the same time, we have, as we've already heard, an extremely successful and thriving and properly capacitated private healthcare system, and that's not just the schemes, that's not just the hospitals and the clinics, that's not even just the private sector healthcare providers, the individuals concerned, the specialists, if you like. It's the integrated aspect of what we can put before the population who pay for that currently. That's the reality. We have a strained or a constrained fiscus, as you've said, and so what we've seen in other areas of collaboration with government is you need to be able to aggregate and pool all of those resources without it being centrally directed. It obviously needs to be regulated. There's a health market inquiry report that came out several years ago, the recommendations of which attach both to the public and the private sector, which have not been implemented, those recommendations. I also need to touch on another point that you made, which is we need to manage expectations. As you say, it's not a question of flicking a switch. It's not as though tomorrow, because we've announced it, this is going to be available on a universal basis. It's actually not going to be available. Indeed, the government has clarified and made it very apparent that this is a long-term process to be able to move into this experience of being able to offer universal health care or universal health coverage to the population at large. We're not managing expectations. The other point that I think we do need to focus on is, who calls the shots? Who has overall responsibility? At the moment, there's far too much discretion given to the minister. We've seen that in many other areas of the economy, as you know, Michael. That's not appropriate. That also needs to be regulated. We need to have a level of independent assessment of performance, the ability to set prices appropriately and properly, but not, if you like, centrally, and certainly not from a single individual or from a single department.
There is, again, this great tendency towards greater centralization, a greater ministerial power through legislation, not just in the healthcare sector, but throughout the economy. From a systems engineering perspective, Tanesh, how do we ensure continuity of care during this transition? Because what concerns me as a user of healthcare is when I see specialists and private practitioners and GPs saying, well, we're uncertain, so we don't even know if we're going to stay. We might go and look for friendlier climes in Canada or New Zealand, for example. That really concerns me. How do we ensure that we find each other and we don't chase away the scarce skills that we have currently?
Sure. I think, firstly, it is actually a real risk. South Africa actually has, some of the world's best trained private healthcare professionals, and they're easily poached. And we're not just competing locally between public and private, we're competing on a global scale. And even through our research, we actually, to achieve NHI, we need to double the number of GPs, we need to triple the number of specialists. So one of the things we have to do is invest in training capacity, invest in possibly new medical schools, enable private sector to train, professionals to come through it. The other important thing, and this is fundamentally across it, we need public-private collaboration. And that is a common theme across the globe where successful UHC is actually improved. Public and private work together to unbottle those bottlenecks for us. So
what does that look like in practice? If you were to say public-private collaboration, are you saying if there's excess bed capacity in a private facility, you start referring public sector patients through pathways into those beds, so you're efficiently utilizing the capacity that you've got? What does it look like?
Sure, and I think you've actually touched on a great example here. Is we do know the public sector is already currently overburdened. We've seen about it, the long queues, etc. There is capacity in the private sector. So, but it has to be done in an appropriate fee contract services. Great example is, cancer, radiation, for example. There was a backlog of 3,000 patients in Gauteng. And firstly, it was a failure of being able to find money to service them in the private sector. Once the money happened, the contracting failed. And that's because, there's possibly not negotiation skills. But the private sector could have actually treated those 3,000 patients. Unfortunately, bureaucracy and admin and all of that has stalled that. And we need to actually unclog that, because at the end of the day, we're talking about patients' lives here. And we need to actually improve. It's no good to just stand here and accept the status quo. We need to actually come together, talk around the table, and unclog those inefficiencies.
Yeah, and again, coming back to what you said, Marty, about growth, if we can start to see better access to quality healthcare for the majority, that'll also then feed back into greater productivity, further fueling economic growth. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. But you've had experience in building bridges between the public and the private sector. You've seen it through COVID, the Solidarity Fund. What works in terms of trying to marry the best of the private and the public sector and to build deeper collaboration in your experience?
Well, I think that there are two or three key ingredients. The first is that we need to have a common fact base. I mean, as you've heard from Barry, there isn't a common fact base right now. There's no alignment as to what the cost will be, what the mechanisms should be. The only way that you get that is through dialogue. That's exactly, of course, what we did in the case of energy, where we established and through the government, the National Energy Crisis Committee, where there needed to be people speaking with one voice about what not only the problems were, but what the aspirational goals were. The same thing applies here. The second is we need to build a level of trust between all role players. I think we need to acknowledge here bluntly that there is not the requisite level of trust. We built that during COVID. I mean, COVID was a crisis that focused people's minds, and we worked together very collaboratively. By the way, you could go and get vaccinated either in the public sector or in the private sector facilities, and the cost was the same. The government agreed what was an appropriate tariff, if you like, for that vaccination process. That trust needs to be established. It needs to be established fast. When we talk about getting people around the table, constitutionally, the government is obliged to ensure that it consults with society at large, and there have been literally tens of thousands of submissions on the NHI Act, which were not taken into consideration. In fact, in reality, none of them were taken into consideration, and that will need to be reviewed. Unfortunately, in the process, two things have happened. One is we've lost a lot of time when we need to provide that healthcare support, particularly to those who are most needy in society. The second is that we've undermined confidence in the system. So it's not just individual practitioners who may think they don't want to be here, but if you're a private healthcare provider, if you're a scheme or if you're a hospital, and there are questions as to the certainty, the predictability of the environment within which you're operating, then you pull back from the sort of commitments that you should be making today for tomorrow for our children and our grandchildren. And I think, therefore, that we need to appreciate the urgency of actually settling the differences that exist at the moment, making sure, as I said, that we can pool all the resources, but in a transparent, credible, and an appropriate manner, and that we account for it accordingly to society at large.
Sadly, it doesn't help when you talk about building and fostering trust that there is rampant corruption in the public healthcare sector, and many SIU cases remain unresolved. Ms. Diokaran, and we remember what happened to her as a whistleblower in Gauteng. These do remain critical barriers. One hopes maybe that in the national dialogue that the President has announced that we'll be able to find space to continue trying to find each other around these particular issues. I want to come back, though, Barry, and talk about the context that we find in South Africa. And it's a context that I think in East Africa they're very familiar with in trying to design systems around informal informal or part-time or gig economy work, where people jump in and out of more formal employment and are so less likely to take up a contractual kind of medical scheme arrangement. Should we be thinking about how we design for our own context in the way we start to build out solutions?
Yeah, sure. That just in time is a real headache for actuaries, because insurance isn't designed sort of to opt in and opt out when you need. Certainly not healthcare insurance. The risk of moral hazard or anti-selection is too high. You'll join. We see it in the prevailing system now. I mean, I think when people get a particular chronic disease or wanting to have a baby, they'll jump into the system, pay medical aid contributions for a while, and then jump out. So there's a net loss to the system. Difficult to design for that. But we have seen some interesting designs on other types of insurance, general insurance, household insurance, and some of that thinking could be applied to healthcare. But again, it comes to what we really need is a design for the system overall. If you're not in a risk-pooled environment, in a medical scheme, say environment or health insurance environment, then you're naturally going to rely on the public sector, but there should be some mechanism to make sure that you're contributing your fair share.
Yeah.
If you're doing that just in time, that's generally frowned upon from a health policy point of view. We try to reduce what we call out-of-pocket payments as far as possible, because they'll tend to penalise those most vulnerable and most in need. So what you really want is as broad a risk pooling as possible from an actuarial and sustainability point of view. But at the moment, because the systems are not coherently designed and not designed to work together, there are massive gaps when people are opting out.
So why is mandatory health insurance off the table then?
I mean, I don't know that it's off the table, but I think it would just be difficult. To force South Africans to do anything turns out to be quite difficult. We don't like it. So to say, well, once you're earning above the tax threshold or whatever income level we choose, you have to belong to a medical scheme. I think people will be upset about that. That said, I mean, some employers do that. So, I mean, many employers have it's obligatory, once you're employed to belong to a medical scheme. So there is precedent for it, but at a national level to make it mandatory, I think it will be difficult, not impossible.
Chatterig, I think, is the term for it. Craig, what are your thoughts? Could we convince South Africans that this isn't asking you to pay for a nice tolled freeway in Gauteng? This is your health care, and ultimately we all care very deeply about our health care. How do we do this?
I think the biggest ambassadors for medical schemes are those that are using the medical scheme and landing up in that exact case where they need to access having a child, which now caesarean section, 65,000 rand. You need to understand what healthcare actually is costing, and then realize the risk that you're assuming not being part of the system. You have to educate people about what it costs and what care they may forego when they need it the most.
Tanesh, if you look at this, I mean, should we be exploring mandatory cover? Is it something that distracts us again, and we don't have time to waste? To Martin's point.
Sure. So I think if you look at South Africa's system, we employed social solidarity principles, and back in the days, and the missing bucket was actually mandatory membership. Now, if you look at various, in fact, insights, if we had mandatory membership, we would probably be 20% cheaper today, maybe more than that in terms of what current membership. Just to understand that, we've got about 4 million taxpayers that are part of medical schemes, and of the 7.5 million, so it's another 3 million people that could have been contributing to it. So, there is always that opportunity. It's been earmarked in the health market inquiry, not necessarily as an immediate step, but it's something we should progress towards. And I do believe it is one alternative to make healthcare cheaper. And anything that's going to make healthcare cheaper, private or public, we should be focused on doing that.
And, listen, there was so much in the health market inquiry about supplier-induced demand and, are the hospitals overbuilding? Are they overbilling, sending you for that MRI twice, 3 times, where maybe one could have done? But it will come back to the politics, Martin, of kind of a mandatory medical scheme introduction, and also using that to cross-subsidize the informal and unemployed. Do you think there's political space for that kind of conversation currently?
I think there's political space for making sure that we can extend the scope of schemes, either current schemes or new schemes. It's no different to a low-cost benefit option. That's another way of addressing some of the big delta in the system. for sure. That requires political courage, of course, and conviction that we can properly communicate to the population at large, perhaps I should say the voter population in particular, that this is in their collective interest and for their benefit. Now, my own sense is that there is a much broader acknowledgement today than there was 5 or 6 years ago that collaboration between all social partners, and particularly between the public and the private sector, is the way to address some of these very challenging issues. What was interesting in the course of COVID, of course, and you touched on the Solidarity Fund, was we saw a huge level of corruption emerge in an area that didn't exist previously, if you remember, just in the context of the procurement of PPE, for example. And yet the Solidarity Fund enjoyed the trust that it did for a couple of reasons. One was because it accounted for every single rand and cent that it received from donors. Some of the donors were individuals who gave 10 rand. Some were institutions and philanthropies that gave hundreds of millions of rand, literally, to the Solidarity Fund. We've not seen the same thing with government, that level of transparency, accountability, consequence management. That is a necessary ingredient in building confidence, if you like, in the system, the existing system and the future system. Now, I think that the political leadership of this country acknowledges that. Certainly we've seen it in the areas that we're already cooperating with. Unfortunately, in many respects, NHI was used as an election tool. I suspect actually the outcome was not the one that was intended, and we're going to have to go back to first principles. We don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, by the way. I think there are many elements, as we've discussed already, of the objectives that we all support and endorse, but we're going to have to make some fundamental changes, even if they're limited changes, and that also requires political courage.
Governance. I mean, it really does boil down to the difference in governance structures that we saw between the Solidarity Fund and what happened in the private sector. And I think I know Nicholas Crisp might argue to Nation that that's why we want a centralised fund, so we can have greater oversight. You see, if everything's decentralised, there's more incentive for bad actors to dip their hands into the pot. How would you respond to that and the governance differences between a single or a multi-fund solution?
Sure. So I think, firstly, international research has shown across the globe where UHE is, a multi-fund is actually the way that happens. It's actually the best principles. Why are we going on a single fund actually, is arguable. But for us, we looked at a single fund model. And when you actually do a single fund model and you incorporate medical scheme membership altogether, medical scheme members are actually older. By virtue of them being older, and you can think about it as, older people actually consume more healthcare resources. Pooling them together, that medical scheme membership is actually going to utilize a lot of the surplus fund, additional funds, way more than your current public sector. So what's going to happen is, if a package costs 100 rand, medical scheme members will utilize 130 rand, and 94 rand will only be left for, the uninsured people. And that's why, that's the negative part of it. We're actually going to lose access to the vulnerable. They will have less healthcare. And that's why supplementary cover multi-fund model takes that risk pool out of it and then leaves more money in the NHI fund for the vulnerable. You can get more healthcare out of that.
What is the role of medical aids under the NHI? And just maybe you can talk to me about how they're currently being regulated. We know you've got prescribed minimum benefits. The least cost benefit option regulations are still outstanding, and so you've got the insurers coming in and offering much cheaper solutions, and you've got the medical schemes fighting with one arm tied behind their backs.
Thanks, and I think latching on that, right? I think so. Medical schemes operate under the Medical Schemes Act under 3 principles. So one is open to enrollment, so anyone can join. There's no kind of discrimination. Community rating. So you've got to charge the same price whether you're healthy or unhealthy. And the third one is PMB packages, and that's about 300 healthcare conditions that have got to be covered for. And the price of that, right, is roughly north of 1,500. So you can't go under that because you've got to cover that by law. Health insurers have an exemption from this. So very much, they can risk rate you, so they can charge the price based on your health status or age. They can refuse you cover, right? And then, quite importantly, they don't have to cover 300 conditions. They can only cover 10 conditions. And as a result, they can offer prices below 1,000 Rand. Now, this is where the issue is, right? We as HFA, as medical schemes, we've been advocating, let us be able to compete on the same level, because we believe through low-cost benefit options, we can provide access for an additional 10 million South Africans to private healthcare. And I must say, we've been arguing for this for about 10 years. And I must say, we're starting to maybe hear some green shoots, because I've been invited to speak in a few weeks to NEDLAC about LCBOs, about low-cost benefit options. So I'm hoping it's the right green shoots.
Well, 10 million lives to bring into the net is not something to be sneezed at. Craig, if you look at it, and we're talking about solutions here, what role could medical schemes play if they were allowed the regulatory room to operate and on a level playing field, and bring down the costs and welcome another 10 million South Africans into that covered net?
Well, I think initially it plays against the fact that we have anti-selection happening in a space where we don't have mandatory cover. So when you need the service, that's when you want to belong to a medical scheme. If you can get typically the younger population that like the health insurance products early on into the medical scheme, you know what their risks are, and you can manage their risks as they emerge with age. One real benefit of a medical scheme is that they're owned by their members. They aren't in it for profits. Health insurers obviously have shareholders and a profit motive in the space. That's why we think medical schemes is a much better place for a LCBO type of offering than a health insured space.
Have you been invited to NEDLAC?
Luckily, we're part of HFA, and we'll let Tanesh handle that.
I've got to come back to the legal cases, and there's 6 now, which all have to run through the courts. But given the litigation cloud hanging over the NHI, maybe we could just run through the panel, Tanesh, and starting with you. What would a legally sound, financially stable, socially credible version of universal healthcare actually look like?
Sure. So, as part of our engagement, right, and HFA has always been this perspective. We don't want to just be critiquing NHI. We don't want to just show the problems. We actually want to put a solution on the table. And that was part of our submission. So we proposed what we called a hybrid multi-fund model, which, enables public-private collaboration, right? Because private sector has all the skills. We've got the knowledge of building a world-class system, fraud skills, etc. We can come to the party to explain how to incorporate DRGs. We do believe, a consistent and tax-based contributions to a common NHI benefit package should be enabled to contract to both public and private sector. So all 61 million people should be able to have that package, and then enable access to supplementary cover for medical schemes. For those members that can afford to, we have, generally going to be the high risk, allow them to buy up. And then it's other important points, which is we must implement and reinforce the HMI recommendations. Competition, innovation, enable choice, standard benefit package. I think, those are key things. And then we must be realistic. We can't, expect the world package. We've got to work within what our finances are.
Yeah.
And we can scale as the economy grows, as jobs grow. So for me, and then the last point I want to say is, regulation should be guardrails. There shouldn't be potholes. And I think that's actually what we need. We need dialogue. We need to understand how do we make something better for everyone.
Yeah, could you imagine Starlink going into rural areas where you're operating a clinic and you can do AI diagnostics, radiography by accessing, the world's best technology, and you overcoming those infrastructure bottlenecks? Just think about what we could do. What would ideal look like from your perspective, Barry?
Yeah, I think there are few possible ideal permutations. I would characterize this particular path, which I've said to, for those that will listen. I think that this is the path of most resistance as opposed to path of least resistance. In a system that's difficult to reform, I don't know that there's been any legislation put forward and passed, maybe Martin you'll be closer to it than me, but that's been so heavily contested by the sector that it's trying to sort of regulate and fix. And I think, as Craig says, that says something for the level of engagement which didn't work out like it's supposed to. I think private funders, medical aids, should be able to buy services from public providers, from public hospitals, and it would increase the funding to those public hospitals. I think public funders through the NHI or current provincial departments of health should be allowed to buy clinical services from private providers where there's spare capacity, with well-governed contracts. I think we stand in our own way and tie our shoelaces together from a bureaucratic and contracting point of view there. But public sector contracting is extremely difficult. So I'm sympathetic to that, but we really must try to find a way around that. So I think a system that's designed much more coherently together as one integrated system would function much better than we have now. What we're worried about is while the focus is on building up capacity on NHI and implementing NHI, that the private sector, the medical aid side, which has been in need of more progressive regulation since 2003, is left to self-implode. And we're seeing that pressure more and more. We warned about the so-called actuarial death spiral in the late 90s. And this is what's played out now over 25 years of above inflation increases on the medical aid side because the regulatory system is imbalanced.
Yep.
It's protective from an open enrollment and community rating point of view, but does not have the risk mitigation pillars you need at that time, mandatory membership and risk equalization, to stabilize the system. And so, that's why we have these contribution increases, which lead to affordability pressure, people anti-selecting, people buying down their cover. And this is not ideal. And if that's left to continue for the next 10 or 15 years, we're going to have real, even a bigger problem on our hands. So what we'd really like is, yes, okay, NHI is pursuing this particular course and the court cases will take their course, but really the private sector and the reforms suggested by the HMI really need attention. Otherwise, we're going to have continued pressure on that side as well.
Yeah, and I think people would, you look at the Eskom death spiral, as it high prices to deal with underinvestment, more people migrate off the grid, and so it goes. And it's been that way in healthcare because, to Martin, to your point, we're also not creating the new jobs and the economic growth that incentivize young members through employee benefits at firms to join schemes. And so what happens, Barry, that actuarial death spiral is just hastening their demise within the current regulatory noose that is around their necks. Is there a solution that satisfies the Constitution, Martin, the financial sustainability and the structural concerns we've raised in the bones of this Act, or do we have to start again?
No, we don't have to start again. I think that if we just build upon what we've already heard from the panel, within the private sector, there's a high level of convergence and alignment as to what is required. We need to be careful, Michael, that it doesn't come across as though somehow or other all the skills, capabilities and experience resides in the private sector, because that is just not so. I mean, we need the public sector just as much as we need the private sector. We actually need both. We need to be able to, within the ambit of the Constitution, and the Constitution clearly provides for this, by the way, make sure that we address the requirements of the most needy in society, who are not being properly serviced by either the private sector or the public sector. That's the reality at the moment. We need to make sure that it's appropriately regulated, that there's competition in the system. What we've heard, and I think it is also very, very, very true, is that we haven't implemented the results of an HMI, a health market inquiry, which identified very significant issues that could be easily addressed, both in the public, by the way, and in the private sector. We need to ensure that we are clear about what our objectives are and we get buy-in from society at large. Here we haven't got buy-in from society at large. The consequences of the legal processes underway, by the way, is that we will paralyze the system completely, both the existing system and what we want to achieve into the future. We can ill afford that in the current environment. And as you said, Michael, when we've got not even anemic growth, I would have to say, almost zero growth in the system, that's the worst possible set of circumstances that can apply. We've got to be able to drive economic growth, not just in the areas where we're partnering with government at the moment, which obviously are clear bottlenecks, whether it's energy, transport and logistics, crime and corruption, as you know, the impact on unemployment and in particular the youth. But we've got to ensure that we can offer the best possible healthcare to all concerned. So we have said as business that we actually don't think that we should throw, as I said, the baby out with the bathwater. We think that there are some fundamental principles that absolutely should be retained from the NHI Act, but we need to make sure that we can address some critical flaws. The role of medical schemes is an absolutely fundamental flaw in the system. The taxing authority and who has responsibility for there's only one department or arm of government that has the ability to raise taxes. That is National Treasury. Okay, National Treasury has made its position clear already on NHI. It has allocated no funds of any significance whatsoever towards this. We need to understand how much it will cost and where that funding will be applied. What the model will be going forwards needs to be interrogated, and as I said, it needs to be interrogated as a matter of urgency, because Rome is literally burning at the moment. People are dying because we're not able to afford them the health care that is required, and we could do so with some limited changes to the existing legislation, but it won't be as it is currently constituted.
And we're not even talking about the withdrawal of PEPFAR funding and other
We haven't even gone there, exactly so.
In our HIV/AIDS
Precisely so.
fight as well. Craig, I'm going to end off with you just on this round of questioning on what good would look like before we go to some questions that we're getting from the online audience. And there are quite a few, so I'd like to get stuck into them. But for you, and where you're sitting as the head of Profmed, what would this ideal outcome look like given what we're presented with?
Yeah, I'd like to return back to the health consumer themselves. I mean, our research initially comes from the professional themselves. We often underestimate the attractiveness of the global markets to the professionals, and it does affect everybody. A professional on average employs 8 to 10 people. That's the average. If you want to improve employment, we need more professionals. We need to retain them. A worrying stat for Profmed over the last 5 years is that out of 10 professionals that leave Profmed, 3 are immigrating. It's the number one reason professionals leave Profmed. It is because the overseas markets are attractive. It is also because we haven't got a sufficient value proposition to retain them in South Africa. And part of that value proposition is that a professional has access to healthcare, proper healthcare. And that's what we need to correct. We need to make sure that not just for the professional, but for every South African, we work on the value proposition for health. Perhaps a national health dialogue is what we actually need. And we need to get away from the legal cases. I think that's going to change the trust dynamics, and it's going to be difficult to get a national dialogue on health and something that delivers quickly and doesn't leave the consumer behind and the voice of the consumer out of the dialogue.
And I know there's a lot of dialogue fatigue out there, and if we were world champions, not just in rugby, it would probably be in dialoguing as well. But this is an area we have to find each other on, and paralysis through lawfare is a lose-lose scenario. So I think that is absolutely key. Some questions from our audience, and Tanesha, maybe if you could weigh in on this. If NHI is delayed or derailed, what is the plan B for achieving universal healthcare in South Africa?
Sure. So, I mean, remember, NHI is a funding mechanism. It's actually about finances. What we really need to do is actually improve healthcare system. So that is really what we can do even today, is strengthen primary healthcare. So prevention is better than cure, making sure people get checks, right? Cancer is actually going to be, read articles, the next HIV thing. The way to stop cancer is actually screening, getting sure you get the diagnosis in. So improving that. The OHSC, Office of Health Standards Compliance, right? Has recently come out and said, 1 in 3 facilities in the public sector do not meet compliance. Now, surely that's something we need to focus on, and improving those facilities. And that's not just about NHI, that's about actually today. And then other things, is the training around it. So we don't have to wait for NHI to happen. There are things on the ground we can actually improve today.
Because those facilities wouldn't be able to contract with the NHI fund even if it were to go into implementation. Barry, I don't know if you want to add on to that, but there's another question that's come back to the finances and how our proposed funding model for NHI compares to what you've seen globally in terms of global best practice.
Global best practice is very tricky from a healthcare financing point of view. I mean, all we would know is that we wouldn't want to follow the US example, really, of 18% of GDP. But in other more mature systems, some are national, with one big central fund, and some are multi-fund. And they perform comparatively the same from both a funding and an outcomes point of view. One of the best systems in the world is the Dutch system, and it's a multi-fund model, of which there are many examples. It's really how the public and private funding fit together that differs by country. I think in our fiscally constrained environment, any system is going to be under financial strain. If we had not had this sort of 15 years of zero growth now, we'd have a 50% larger economy, 25% more jobs. And in fact, if you do the math back of the envelope, the public health system would have as much money right now almost as if we combined public and private anyway. If we had just stayed on the growth curve of the rest of the world, just been average, then we would have been in a much better place. But in terms of design, multi-funder, single-funder, there's not one best model. It's really ideologically driven. And most of the guidance actually from the WHO and the like is to recognize where you're starting from and move on from there. If you read social security literature for a country like South Africa with high income disparity, high Gini coefficient, high unemployment, the general thinking is those that can afford to look after themselves in a risk-pooled kind of way should do that. And the government through taxes should be looking after the vulnerable. And we have lots of the vulnerable. But generally speaking, for our level of economic development and particularly income dynamics, a more acceptable international design would usually be, as I say, sort of the wealthier to look after themselves and contribute heavily into the tax pool. I think the numbers are 70 or 80%, the same people contributing into the general tax pool for benefits they don't use. That would be. But the ideologies are different. So some people think that you need one fund so that there's central control. You can bring prices right down, which will also have effects, by the way. That's where a lot of the arguments are at an ideological level.
Power, no, certainly that's where Nicholas Crisp seems to think some of the great benefits of this design of a single fund will be found. It does come back down to growth, Martin, doesn't it? I mean, that's a very stark stat that the government, the public sector budget would be just as large now if we had growth over the last 15 years. In fact, we have gone backwards, not even growing at population growth rate. So it is about getting growth going again. I want to come back to a question here, and I think it's actually directed at you, Craig. And if you look at your State of Health report that you've just released, are there any pressing realities that policymakers or we may be overlooking in the NHI debate from the research that you've gathered from your members?
I think the one point that does come through is that we need better management of health services itself, whether in the public or even in the private space. So mandatory membership was a reform that most chose in terms of how to improve healthcare in the private sector. But the other point across both public and private is that we need better leadership and management of the healthcare service.
Are we seeing that kind of leadership come through with the government of national unity in what you've seen so far? Or are we seeing ideological interests still holding sway?
I think at the moment the ideological interests are certainly dominant in terms of who is the Minister of Health. And trying to achieve the National Health Act's intentions, which was signed just before the GNU came into being. But I do think there's a long-term realism that is hitting and probably will hit quite carefully when we start hearing the Minister of Finance, when we start hearing how difficult it is to grow the economy, how difficult it is to raise the tax revenue that we need to finance healthcare.
And Martin, coming back to you, one of our online audience wants to know about PEPFAR and whether or not we've thought through the Business for South Africa initiative or others of ways to help plug what is quite clearly a gap. And do we know how big that gap is?
Yeah, so PEPFAR is a very interesting situation, Michael, because of course we didn't see it coming. South Africa, in fact, is the only country in the world that's had an executive order all to itself, a very negative executive order, as we know, and one of the consequences of that was the cessation of USAID support and PEPFAR funding, which is about 17% of the budget, about 7 billion rand in respect of HIV and AIDS, specifically and particularly. Obviously, the private sector can't step up to fill that gap. There are multiple demands on the private sector, not just in terms of financial capital, but human capital as well. And that's why we're directing it, as we have been, to the areas that we're focusing on in the partnership with government. Having said that, we have reached out to the Minister of Health. We've said that we're happy to see how we can collaborate and cooperate. In the final analysis, when we see the strictures on the budget, I think that there should be, and I'm speaking personally here, I think there should have been an emergency appropriation by the Minister of Finance to fill the gap to the extent that the Department of Health couldn't reallocate its budgetary appropriation accordingly, because we know that this is absolutely fundamental and critical. As the Minister of Health said, you know, those who are donors can decide not to donate, and that's effectively what the President of the United States had determined, with very significant ramifications, not just, by the way, in the context of PEPFAR, but also NIH. Much of the academic research and technical research that takes place in the country here is actually not just for South Africa's benefit, but for the global good. And that is also dissipated. So my own feeling is that actually we need to think very pragmatically and cautiously about where we place our limited rands. And obviously healthcare needs to be at the front of the queue, but then it needs to be done in a responsible and accountable manner. People don't have trust at the moment in the system. You've mentioned this yourself, Michael, that there is responsible spending for every rand and cent that's in the system. We need to do that if we're going to build trust, and equally we need to do so if we're going to make sure that we can ensure cooperation and collaboration. I just have to say that I am very cautious about yet another dialogue, because in reality the process that the government is supposed to go through in terms of consultation around any piece of legislation such as the NHI Act would by definition extend to that. But then they have to take into consideration, and they have to take account of, I have to say, the inputs that have been made thus far. If that had happened already, we wouldn't be having this debate around this table. I mean, it didn't happen.
That was one of the primary concerns I had, and Barry, with the initial NHI process, and when there were public comments and submissions, there were reams and reams of submissions from professionals, from affected stakeholders, and yet we didn't see any of those submissions wind up in the final NHI Act that we received. And that to me feels like we're dealing, you know, on a basis where, regardless of all the debates that we may have, what we're talking about around the table right now is academic. How do we resolve that? I know you're an actuary, and I'm talking politics now. But
well, politics and law. I mean, just a little outside of my field, but I don't know. It is very disheartening, and that's unfortunately why I think we are in where we are with the legal cases. So I think the stakeholders felt that that was their only recourse left to them for not being heard, was to follow this route, and now the courts will have to take a view.
Well, Tanesha, I mean, you are one of those litigants, and is that accurate?
Yeah, I think, you know, firstly, we realize, right, going to court actually is going to take one extreme amount of time, distraction, and at the end of the 5 years, when we probably aim to get into Constitutional Court, we can have one winner and one loser in that case. But the biggest loser is actually South Africa's healthcare system. The opportunity cost to actually do reform. And that's why, while we have to follow suit with this legal case, we do want to, and hopefully through the booster engagement with the President, find an amicable way to actually do healthcare reform. Because at the end of the day, our country is too important for us to be won and lost in a court case. We need to do action. We need to do something now.
Has the fact that you've now resorted to going to court received any positive response from government, from the Minister of Health, to open his door to talk outside of the legal process?
Sure. So, I mean, I think we're still early stages, but, you know, I've heard there is positive intentions, you know, through the BUSA channel to engage at the president level, who is actually, you know, the head of state and the person who actually should be driving this. So we look forward to those conversations.
I want to come back to a question from our audience, and Craig, it's addressed to you. How do we ensure that whatever path we take, health equity remains our North Star in all of this?
I think the important part is to describe what health equity is. Health equity at a low level of quality standard is certainly not health on its own. And so we have to actually make sure the resources are stacked, the management expertise is there, certainly the funding is realistic, and we know what we can do optimally with the funding in terms of moving universal health care into a far better WHO rating than we currently experience.
And what is the role of Profmed then in taking us to that North Star?
So Finder, for instance, the platform that we created for doctors, is really designed around the fact that we want to keep resources in the country. We want the doctors employed. We want to make sure that they are the foundation of the future universal healthcare system in South Africa. So I think as a private sector, we all have a fundamental role in terms of securing our futures and securing the futures of not just those that are employed, but the unemployed, the most vulnerable. We need to actually make sure we have a good healthcare system that delivers better than what we're doing now.
Martin, I want to come back to where we have seen very positive collaboration through Operation Vulindlela, for example, and we're now in OV phase 2. Big component of that is local government and a few other key areas, and ensuring we get the energy reforms and the logistics reforms over the line. But if you were advising the President or Rudy Dex right now, what would your single piece of advice be to help bring parties together, given what we've just discussed? There still seems to be a yawning chasm between the ideologues and the pragmatists around how we can move forward from these positions.
Well, Vulindlela, of course, Michael, is predicated upon the need for structural reform. Structural reform to ensure that we can get the economic growth into the system that's required. Because without economic growth, we don't have the fiscal flexibility to address any of these challenges. We know at the moment that at less than 3.5% when we launched phase 2 of the partnership in November of last year, we increased the levels of unemployment. 3.5% growth, and those who are the most impacted, of course, are the youth. Well, we're so far behind that target that it's just a theoretical proposition at the moment. It cannot afford to be a theoretical proposition. And in the context of Vulindlela, both 1 and, as you say, 2.0, a very specific set of interventions were defined by government, overseen, of course, by the President, led by Rudy Dix, exactly as you've said, with the private sector making sure that its expertise is availed to the government at an arm's length basis. We're very mindful of the need to avoid any perception of conflicts, let alone real conflicts of interest, and where in a targeted way, things that are blockages to the system can be assessed and addressed. I don't think it's quite the same here, because here we have to have a holistic approach. You have to have a holistic approach. As we said already, NHI is fundamentally a funding mechanism, but it's not just a funding mechanism. It's actually ideologically driven in terms of who determines what healthcare is made available to whom, at what basis, and over what period of time, as well as how it is not only provided but funded. Now, I think that there are a limited number of key principles, the same thing applied in Vulindlela, that need to be agreed. Some of them, by the way, are not contentious. Others are. That is exactly what has been, if you like, the underpin of the approach that BUSA, For and on Behalf of Business, has adopted. It's not in the public domain, but many of the interventions and the suggestions that have been made around this table find their way into that proposal. The matter sits currently with the President. We have every reason to believe that he is considering how best to move forward under the circumstances, because, as we've all said, it cannot be in the national interest to have gridlocked paralysis, effectively, because if we have gridlock paralysis, we're going to achieve the worst of all worlds rather than the best of all worlds. And the clock is ticking, as we were saying earlier on, Michael.
I want to come back, Barry, to the health market inquiry. A lot of effort, time, resources was spent on producing some really excellent recommendations, outcomes, and research. So if we implemented just some of the HMI recommendations, like proper oversight, a supply-side regulator, and value-based contracting, how far would that get us to universal healthcare?
It would make some progress. I mean, I would say there are large-scale interventions at a system level, and then there are more market-fixing interventions that make the market function better and greater competition, innovation, emphasis on quality, for example. The bigger changes required are the harder ones. You know, a risk equalization mechanism, some dealing with the anti-selection problem through mandatory membership or some other kind of mechanism. Those are difficult to achieve, but that's where you have the best bang for buck, because that fixes structural flaws in the regulatory paradigm and system that we have at the moment. Those you would get, there would be big and quick wins if you could achieve them. The getting the market to work better, emphasizing quality of care, measurement, transparency, a supply-side regulator, better ways to negotiate, some collective bargaining for the smaller actors in the system. That would improve competitiveness in the system, and over time would slow down this spiral, this above inflation that we see in the medical aid contribution. So we can't look at these things as in 1 year windows. As I say, we have the benefit now of looking back over 25 years and seeing all the early warnings that we were worried about. And unfortunately, many of them have panned out, and we really must try to avoid falling into the trap for the next 10 or 15 or 25 years.
I want to come back to the funding so you've got a system whereby if you choose private medical care, you don't have to pay an additional NHI tax, but if you choose not to, then you've got an NHI tax that you've got to pay. Have you done any research as to what level that might be at, and how that might increase the tax burden on a particular individual?
Yeah, we've done some work. Actually, a colleague and myself presented at the Actuarial Society Convention. We presented a presentation on this, outlining some of the scenarios. It's quite hard to peg a particular figure, but just to spitball a number, a 4% income tax for those above the tax threshold that are not medical aid members would yield about 30 to 35 extra billion rand in revenue, which is about the same as the medical tax credit. And actually, we played with different scenarios, and if you look at the extremes, you have a situation where, for example, if in the extreme case everybody dropped off their medical scheme membership, now there would be a 4%, say, NHI tax for all income earners above the tax threshold. That would result in meaningfully more money into this public system or NHI. And so as a fluidity mechanism, as transportability mechanism, it would work well, but it would be quite tricky to peg a figure. We used 4% just as an indicative value to show the orders of magnitude. I should say Treasury don't particularly like earmarked taxes, so that would be a one hurdle to overcome. It gives, it puts more inflexibility in the budget for them to allocate funds. But I mean, there's a lot of precedent internationally for social security taxes, particularly, and healthcare taxes, as an example.
Yeah, we saw that whole debate around the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project around why we couldn't just use a fuel levy to pay for this, because it doesn't like ring fencing taxes for purpose. It's an ideological issue more than a technical issue. It doesn't stop us from revisiting it and for this purpose saying, right, there's a way of doing this. If you were to look at the two paths of one journey kind of scenario, Tanesh, I mean, the HMI envisioned a reformed, a better regulated private sector that could partner with the public system, and that partnership is key. Should we be seeing the NHI and the health market inquiry as two tracks on the same journey, or is government ignoring one to force the other?
Sure. So I think the NHI actually came out before the final publication of the health market inquiry, right? So the health market inquiry had sight of what the NHI paper was. And it actually, it didn't say change, whatever is in the private sector. It actually suggested a lot of progressive steps on the private sector, and it actually saw a pathway for that within the NHI. I think somewhere along the line, ideologically, we've diverted or diverged from that kind of unison page, and where I think NHI is kind of seen as the de facto solution going forward. And that's clearly not, the way we see it. It's not a sustainable way we view it going forward. So ideally, HMI has come up with some good recommendations that are still relevant to today.
There's a question from the audience here. If you could wave a magic wand tomorrow, and if I could wave one, we'd have another World Cup in the rugby. But implement 3 of the HMI's proposals today, what would they be, and how would that help us take real steps towards universal healthcare?
Sure. So I think, firstly, risk adjustment mechanism, RAMS. So that will mean, currently, unfortunately, because of medical schemes compete on young lives. Young lives, less claims, more surplus generation. And that's unfortunately what the problem is. Risk adjustment metrics will take that out. It'll equalize the playing field. It's what we've got in Australia, New Zealand, etc. That will automatically bring competition around products and innovation on design of benefits. And I think that's number 1. Number 2, I think, the supply side regulator, in terms of how we engage I think one of the evils is fee for service. We pay, based on how many visits you go. We shouldn't be paying for visits. We should be paying for outcomes. When you go somebody, you actually want to know you're getting better. And that's actually which we should be. And that's one of the things. Move away from fee for service, move towards value-based care.
Yeah.
And pay for the outcome of getting help.
So you're not incentivizing repeat visits.
Absolutely, and I think that is one of the biggest, and most challenging, I think, obstacles we have to overcome. We are making, inroads towards that, but I think there's still a large chasm. So I think that's my top 2, and there's. Let me stop with those top 2. I think there's a few others as well, but.
There's a follow-up, and maybe Craig, if you could pick up on this one. Could a hybrid model that blends the HMI's market reforms with a phased public funding rollout be more maybe politically and financially feasible, given our constraints?
Yeah, I always think maybe it's the accounting background, but I always think you have to know what your budget is. So I think that creates a framework in terms of determining what benefits you can actually offer. And I'd work from that perspective.
But the issue that I have is that the bill leaves so many things uncertain still. The extent of benefits, the reimbursement rates, all of that is to be determined later. How does that impact the affordability of the NHI and the provision of this grand dream if we don't even know what we're talking about?
I think that is the gap and the vacuum in the bill, is that it's not very clear, and without the clarity, we don't have any realistic understanding of the role of medical schemes, the role of a healthcare practitioner. What is their role? What does the reimbursement look like? Are they going to receive less? Are they going to work more? These are fundamental parts. Without knowing what benefits you have or what you're offering and what they're going to be priced at and whether you can actually pay, I think maybe the distrust between a government or a centrally controlled purse in terms of funding those services, even to a private practitioner, is going to be a real issue in terms of how we see doctors remain in the country, how we see doctors feel valued in the country.
And that is a big component in this whole, before I move on from that point, Craig, a big, almost missing component in that you're talking, and Barry mentioned, it's probably amongst all the sectors where you've tried to implement, legislate, reform, the biggest pushback, and your key stakeholders are exactly those, your doctors and nurses that certainly haven't bought into this. What were some of the insights that you drew from the research about the primary reasons for their unhappiness with the NHI? Did you ask that question?
I think it's the general feeling that they may be fully employed by NHI.
Right.
Will they be able to have a choice of having private work? If 90% of your income is generated only by NHI, do you really have a negotiating space to negotiate reasonable fees? Or are you going to be grouped? And there's part of the structure that talks about CUPs, which basically says if you're in a specific area as a healthcare provider, would you look after these 1,000 people? And we'll pay you for the 1,000 people, but they could access you 10 times as much as you think they're going to access you. So the volumes is a real issue. And does an individual practitioner have then the ability to negotiate something that looks fair with a centralized, powerful single payer?
And I think a lot of the constitutional challenges are around that issue of choice. Barry, coming back to reimbursement rates, do we have any idea about how reimbursement rates will be determined, given what information has been shared around that area? And do you believe they could and will adequately cover provider costs, given what we know?
So, as Craig says, there's quite a bit of missing information there, which, to be fair, would be difficult to put in an act. You would expect some of those to be in regulation.
Yeah.
But that is what's driving a lot of anxiety. There is a fair bit of work going on behind the scenes, from what we can tell, on the reimbursement models spoken about in the NHI Act, things like capitation and fixed fee reimbursement for hospital cases as opposed to global budgets. So there's some activity there. It's a long road. These are complicated things to build up. You need data, you need expertise, you need capacity. And you need some clarity on what benefits are going to be funded within those reimbursement structures. So there is some work going on there from what we know, but it's yet to really sort of come above the line and be made public, which again, the uncertainty and the causes anxiety. Whether or not the price points will cover, what current private sector providers, whether they're institutional or professional, would like to charge, I think is probably, if you have to put your finger on, the most anxious point amongst private sector providers, that's it. Because the rhetoric in the NHI is very much about lowering cost so that there can be higher access. But it goes to some of the detail in the court cases that, unless the input cost base could be dramatically lowered, a much lower price point, whether it's for doctors or hospitals, would put them underwater. And so, how will that work? And so, if you have a monopsony purchaser, does it undermine supply, which would do the exact opposite of what you want to do in terms of increasing access? So there's a lot of complexity there still to be developed. And we wait to see the detail that'll come out, but it is a sore point of anxiety for the provider side of the market.
Yeah, and we've got, and to get into the weeds a little bit, Tanesh, and clause, I think 38.6 requires private service providers to procure from suppliers that are chosen by the fund. What impact might this have on competition and the freedom of private service providers to conduct their business?
Sure. So it's quite an actual important point, right? If you are not part of the NHI fund, right, can you actually contract outside? Can actually medical schemes use them? And that is part of the kind of clarity that's needed, and that's actually what's causing tension, right? Uncertainty causes tension, and this act is leaves too many gaping holes. And fundamentally, what we are tinkering with, right, is actual people's salaries. And you don't know, are you going to be better off, worse off, and those are the anxieties that exist amongst providers. So that particular clause, is to be defined, I think.
You did release some really good research by Genesis Analytics, and I think its modelling is kind of central to your argument. Can you explain to us what the modelling revealed about the affordability of the NHI? And I think coming back to the very beginning of our conversation.
Sure. So what we looked at is firstly, the NHI Act actually, and what government has promised, that every single 61 million person, every one of 61 million people will receive the same or better equivalent cover that you receive in medical schemes. So what Genesis Analytics did and said, after 45.5% savings efficiencies that they suggested that could theoretically be achieved, it would come, the bill would come to 941 billion rand for NHI per year, right? And that's based on 22 months. To afford that, it would mean that personal income tax would have to increase by double. It would mean that current members, or current taxpayers, which we only have 7.4 million taxpayers in the country, would experience a decrease in take-home pay between 12% and 36%. So that means you're donating between 1 and 3 paychecks towards NHI. And then importantly, besides that, I mentioned the VAT is 15 to 36% increase if we just use VAT. But on top of it, you need 286,000 additional healthcare providers to be able to afford that. That's just on
Additional.
on
But
additional.
we're producing, what, 3,500 medical graduates a year?
Absolutely. So 3,600 medical graduates a year. To become a doctor or a specialist takes between 9 and 13 years. So 286,000 is, is not something that's achievable in this decade. And then, going back to it, so that's just, comprehensive care for all 61 million people. Now, the other, obviously, spark and debate, which is, there's about 532 billion rand currently spent between public and private healthcare sector combined. Now, if that all is pooled into one fund, right, it would mean people who are taxpayers and medical scheme members particularly would have to pay 1.5 times what they're currently paying in tax and receive 43% less healthcare. Now, across the sector, right, and I think it's one of the most important points is, if we don't have enough funds, and that's quite obvious there, and if we don't have enough healthcare practitioners, the end result is what we call healthcare rationing. And healthcare rationing is something, it means longer waiting queues, unavailability of procedures. And we've seen it in particularly, some instances, which is if, in public sector, if you're a baby that's born under a kg, you're left to nature, you're not necessarily going to be able to receive, neonatal care. The other one is, for example, it comes back to Constitutional Court's case, which is the Subramani case. If you're over 65 and you require renal dialysis, which is a reality given where we are in terms of non-communicable diseases, a lot more people need that. You are left to basically survival rates and availability of beds and so on. So those are real issues.
Yeah. We've got 5 minutes left, chaps, so I just want to give you all maybe a parting comment for our audience today. Some might say, why don't we just deal with this through amendments to the Act, Craig? But how would you like us to move forward in a constructive way where we try and overcome some of these very difficult challenges? To Barry's earlier point, is probably one of the most difficult systemic things to reform healthcare.
Yeah, I think the first thing is we have to remove all the distractions as best we can. If it is the fact that the NHI Act is amended, then we should move forward to do that. If it's retracted or there's a view that the regulations will never come through, then let's start some type of discussion in terms of how do we improve healthcare. I think the problem is we're talking again, if we do start the dialogue, it might take 2 or 3 years to actually get moving, to change how healthcare service is delivered. We actually need this tomorrow.
Yeah.
There are people that will be affected. There will be people that can't get access to cancer treatment, while there's 20% capacity sitting in the private sector. That's wrong. We need to change the wrong.
Yeah, but we can't afford the paralysis either, Martin.
So we need to acknowledge that there's a problem. We need to, which I think we all do in terms of the healthcare system in the country, we need to use what aspects of the Act we can currently use, but we need to do it by, as I said, crowding in the resources and the skills that exist, both human and financial capital, in the system, and that is primarily, but not only in the private sector. That's what we've said. I think that is acknowledged by the government, but we need to do it in a manner that can roll it out in a phased way, which doesn't undermine confidence. At the moment, confidence doesn't exist in the system at all. We've got high levels of anxiety, as you've heard, at an individual, institutional, and I would say at a national level, which needs to be addressed as a matter of absolute urgency. I think there is nothing more important right now than dealing with this in a very clear manner, and the government demonstrating that it's open not only to dialogue, but to inputs, both inputs in terms of the legislation, but more importantly, inputs in terms of cooperation and collaboration.
I think if ever there was a test of the GNU's ability
this will be it.
To reform, this must be it, Barry.
Correct.
Yeah, I'd like to close on 2 comments. The first one is a little sidestep. When I talk about social determinants of health and a large portion of the vulnerable portion of our healthcare system, I sometimes ask the audience, what would be the one thing we could do in South Africa to improve the health? What would have the most impact? And by far, the answer to that is more jobs.
Yeah.
The health system needs attention. That'll be my second point. But if we could only do one thing with the magic wand, I would actually, for the health system, actually, I would say it has its problems, but what we need as an overriding macro factor is to get back to an economic growth path. We would have more employed people that could look after themselves much better. We would have more tax to spend on the vulnerable. Much of the affordability pressure we experience in the system right now would have been ameliorated. So I would say we need to become obsessive about economic growth, at least world average, but there's no reason we shouldn't outperform. We have everything we need to outperform world GDP growth. I think that should be taking a disproportionate amount of attention. Second thing would be that I would plea that while we're sorting out and coming to terms in a dialogue or through the courts or through whatever other mechanism there is, coming to terms with what NHI means, I would plea for the reforms suggested by the HMI that everybody knows that the private sector needs, that those are given attention and appropriate capacity to implement, because otherwise we're going to have another 5, 10, 15, 20 years of atrophy and cost escalation in the private sector, and then we won't have much to talk about putting the systems together because of the kind of cost pressure that will happen over another 2 decades in that system. So it's actually critical that the system get the regulatory attention that it needs, not with lip service and get tied up in sort of these bureaucratic processes, many of which we've been involved in, but real practical reforms that there's not much contention about. As difficult as the HMI process was for the system, I think most parties, almost all parties, would agree that those reforms are fine and would improve the system. So the two things, economic growth obsessively, and then while we're sorting out NHI to please implement the reforms everybody agrees with for the private sector.
My vote for Finance and Health Minister. Maybe we need to merge them into one as a cost-cutting measure as well. Tanesh, I'll give you the last word.
Great, thanks. I mean, they've really echoed quite a few sentiments I had in mind, but let me just add on to what they've said. Two practical things. I think the first thing is the engagement that the President is having with BUSA. Let us put some priority on that. That for me is the high road. And it's the way to do it. And the second thing, and I'm going to come back to this, let us enable low-cost benefit options. 10 million people we can enable to primary healthcare. And just to give you an idea, the World Health Care Organization says, if we can sort out primary healthcare, it could add 3.7 years of life by 2030 to low-middle income countries. 3.7 years of life expectancy. Let us sort out LCBOs, let us get primary healthcare, strengthened. And those are my 2 points.
And I mean, that really, it sounds so sensible, low-hanging fruit. Let's certainly hope that we start heading towards that particular road and outcome. Well, that brings us to the end of a powerful and timely discussion. Thank you very much to our panelists, our keynote speaker, and our audience at home. This isn't the end of the conversation, as evidenced by the various ongoing legal cases challenging various aspects of the NHI and obviously what we've just said. As Profmed's own data has shown, healthcare reform must be evidence-led, it must be collaborative, and ultimately South African in design, being aware of our context. Well, from all of us here at Business Day TV, thank you for joining us for this essential debate on the future of healthcare in South Africa.
South Africa's healthcare system is under tremendous strain. Patients wait for hours, some traveling hundreds of kilometers in the hope of seeing a doctor. At the same time, over 800 qualified young doctors stand ready to help, yet they are unemployed. That's why Profmed created Finder, a platform that connects graduate doctors with practices with locum needs. Through Finder, you'll find meaningful work opportunities with practices eager for your talent. To kickstart your journey, Profmed is offering a special incentive. The first 100 doctors to sign up will receive 6 months of free medical aid with Profmed. Finder offers more than just jobs. It's a movement to improve healthcare access and empower young doctors. If you're ready to make a difference, join Finder today and be part of South Africa's healthcare solution. Finder, your journey begins here. Together, let's shape the future of healthcare in South Africa. Finder by Profmed. finder.doctor. Medical aid for professionals.